have a perception that here in New Zealand you are rather ahead of the game in terms of thinking about gambling as a health problem, thinking about it in terms of public health, and in beginning to try and find ways of standing up to the powerful forces that are responsible for the expansion of gambling and the harm that is caused by gambling. And that really is the theme of what I want to talk about this morning. It's I think about power and in a way how we stand up to that power. The book that you've kindly referred to already, called an Unsafe Bet. This is a reference, the title was chosen because it's a reference to a British government report when the government was considering new legislation which became the 2005 Gambling Act in Britain. This was the first major bit of legislation about gambling that we've had in Britain since the 1960s. And basically what it has done is to change the rules about gambling, to change the way in which gambling is officially viewed, and it's been a major factor in continuing the process of expanding gambling in Britain and making gambling more accessible to people in Britain. Prior to that act, there have been changes over the last 20 or 30 years, with gambling becoming more accessible, new forms of gambling joining traditional forms of gambling. But the 2005 Act undoubtedly has given a huge boost to that process of liberalisation of gambling in Britain. And the document, the government document that preceded the Act was called A Safe Bet for Success. So clearly the government reckoned that its liberalising changes were going to be safe. And my argument is, and my perception is, that they're far from safe. They're very unsafe. Hence the title of my book, An Unsafe Bet, the dangerous rise of gambling and the debate we should be having. And basically what I'm trying to argue in the book is essentially those four things that you can see there, that there's been an extraordinary rise in the accessibility of gambling. I know this is not just Britain, but it certainly happened in Britain. That gambling is dangerous. It's dangerous because it's potentially addictive, that our natural resistance to gambling and experiencing problems related to gambling is in danger of being eroded. And finally, and I think perhaps most importantly, that government and most of the rest of us are conniving in this. We're colluding with this. Why is this happening? Why is it possible that such a dangerous commodity is being allowed to become so much more accessible to us and make us all vulnerable to the harms that it may cause? Why are we allowing it? How is it happening? And then there's self-exclusion. And we heard yesterday, those of you who were here and listened to that really impressive session, I agree, that session about the consumer panel was very impressive yesterday. And there was at least one person who was talking about how useful it had been for one to be able to self-exclude oneself from the casinos across the country. What an extraordinary thing. It's like me going to Marks and Spencer's and being stopped at the door and them saying, would you like to commit yourself to only buying so many pairs of socks or underpants? And them telling me that they have a program as part of their social responsibility program that I could self-exclude myself from all the branches of Marks and Spencer's across Britain if my buying of socks and underpants had got so out of control that I felt I couldn't control it. What an extraordinary thing. The point about this, I think, is that gambling is not an ordinary commodity. And the thinking behind the 2005 Act in Britain, and the thinking behind, I suppose, your Act in 2003 and the Acts in other countries, is that it is an ordinary commodity. We can leave this to the free market. This is just like anything else. It's in the commercial area. It creates wealth for the country. It should be encouraged. Its innovation and expansion should be encouraged. but it is no ordinary commodity. It is a dangerous activity. It is potentially addictive. Let me pass on to tell you just some results of the latest British gambling prevalence survey. This is interesting, not just because of the results, but because of the way the results are interpreted. What you show here are the results for 2007 in the blue, the survey we did then, and the most recent survey in 2010. Two screening measures of problem gambling. One, the 10 items based on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, so I call that the DSM-10, and the second measure is the Canadian Problem Gambling Severity Index, 9 questions, so I call that the PGSI-9, and the adult prevalence of problem gambling according to the DSM scale had gone up from 0.6%. This is the whole adult population from 16 onwards, whether you ever do any gambling or not, so it includes people of my age who tend not to do much gambling at all, and everybody in the population. 0.6% were considered to be above the threshold according to the DSM in 2007, and that had gone up by 50% to 0.9 by 2010. And that difference, because there's obviously a standard error around that difference, it may or may not be statistically significant, that in fact is just statistically significant at the conventional 1 in 20 probability level. And according to the PGSI, the prevalence of adult prevalence of problem gambling had gone up from 0.5 to 0.7. That's a 40% increase, not quite such a big increase, and it wasn't statistically significant, but it's an increase of 40%. The interesting thing to me is the way in which people have looked at those results. The Gambling Commission, who were responsible for commissioning the survey, produced a press release which buried those results way down low in the press release. They started off with trivial things that seem to me to be quite trivial, like the numbers of people who've done any gambling at all in the last year has gone up from 76% to 78% or something like that. That seems to me to be relatively unimportant. The real findings, these were buried way down, didn't get any press attention at all as a consequence. The government department responsible for gambling is now holding a review of the 2005 Gambling Act to see how well it's working. And a lot of attention has been paid to these results. So the people who've provided both written evidence and oral evidence have spoken about these results a lot. And there are those people who say these results show that the prevalence of problem gambling has stayed the same, they say. And they argue that because they say there were two different scales. One didn't produce a statistically significant finding. The other only just produced a statistically significant finding. There are others who say that it's gone up, but it's gone up by a trivial amount. My argument is that although we need more data, we need another survey, although I have to say we're unlikely to get another survey because funds for almost everything are being cut in the UK at the moment, and it's unlikely that such a study will be funded again in the foreseeable future. My argument is that the prediction of many people was that the prevalence of problem gambling would rise once the 2005 Act came fully into being, which it did in 2007. So that is the hypothesis, is that the prevalence would rise. According to both screens, it has risen, and in one case it reaches statistical significance. And therefore, on the balance of probabilities, it is looking as if the prevalence has risen. The prediction, by the way, was made even by the committee that made the recommendations for the liberalisation of gambling on which the 2005 Act was based. Even they predicted it would go up. They've got a paragraph in their report where they recommended all these liberalising changes. They said, we have asked ourselves whether it's likely, if our recommendations are followed, that the prevalence of problem gambling will go up. We think it probably will. So even the committee that was the forerunner to the 2005 Act predicted that this would happen. But it is controversial, as all science is controversial, and evidence, people say we need evidence about things, but evidence always needs to be interpreted.